Okay, right. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. So whether you're a regular FMB webinar attendee or this is your first webinar session with us, you're very welcome. The last webinar that we ran on the 18th of January was focused on the new developer guide that has been published by the Construction Leadership Council. And if you're engaged in new build or self-build projects and you haven't yet seen that, I'd recommend having a look. The document and the recording of the last webinar are both available on the FMB website and well worth a visit. And following on from that, we've got some more guidance today aimed at FMB members who build new homes. And this is about the gigabit legislation, which developers need to be aware of to make sure that the new homes of the future are all enabled for the connectivity that we're all going to need in years to come. So a bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions as we go through the presentation, just type them in the Q&A box that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen if you hover your mouse over that area of the screen. No such thing as a daft question. It's always worth saying that. So please go ahead and pop questions in there if you have any as we go through. After the webinar session, you will receive a follow-up email, which will have copies of the slides and a link to the recording, so that you don't have to note absolutely everything down as we go through the session. And the session should last about 45 minutes. We'll get through it in that time, depending how many questions we have from you at the end of the session. So we have a team of people here from Openreach today, who are one of the service providers in this field, and they will be able to answer any questions and speak a bit later about what they do. So there's Andy Nielsen from the Strategic Infrastructure team and others of his colleagues here from Openreach as well, who will join us on screen shortly. But first of all, I'd like to introduce to you Paul DeCourt, who is the Principal Building Services Professional at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And Paul has some presentation slides that he's going to share with us on this topic now. So Paul, I will hand over to you if you'd like to put your camera on, and we'll get the slides up on screen for you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hayley. Hope you can all hear me and see the slide there. Yep. Okay, right. Well, thank you, FMB, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I've got quite a few slides to run through, so I won't dwell on the intro really. But the idea, the FMB developers are a key audience that we need to reach in raising awareness of these new requirements. Next, please, Alan. Right. So before I get into what the new requirements are, a little bit about why we're doing it. It's been certainly this government, it was in their manifesto to deliver nationwide gigabit connectivity as soon as possible. And there are some targets there. There's 85% coverage by 2025, and the Levelling Up white paper, which is the department I work for, includes a target to have nationwide gigabit connectivity by 2030. I say it's a government priority, and we've had quite a few prime ministers come and go over the last few months, so you would have seen that, obviously. But in every speech they make outside number 10, gigabit always gets some mention, so it does remain right up there amongst all the priorities that government have. And it was brought into stark contrast in the pandemic restrictions, which went on for 2 years, didn't they? And that showed just how critical it is that we need to be connected. So, a fast and reliable gigabit or connectivity allows us to do what we're doing now, webinars like we're having now. It allows us to work from home more flexibly. I've put in there a couple of other items, accessing vital health and educational services online. It supports those with social inclusion, and it's good for economic growth. There are some other sort of first world things in there, like gaming and streaming TV and shopping, but the key thing is that more and more is being done online. It gives us the flexibility, and we need a good, reliable, robust service. So mandating gigabit connectivity to new homes is part of this wider national deployment across the nation to everybody. But it comes with a cost, obviously. Everything comes with a cost when we regulate. So we've, alongside the requirements, we've introduced a cost cap. for each dwelling. And also the network operators, or some network operators, have made financial contributions or committed to make financial contributions to developments. So hopefully that will keep the requirements proportionate. But it's not just about the cost, there's also benefits. So there's a consumer value to good connectivity, and we see that some home buyers are more willing to purchase if it's got good connectivity in the home, in the new home, and in potentially pay more for those good broadband speeds. There was a report done in 2020, 2021, I believe, that showed the impact on the average house sale price was about 0.6 to 0.7%. Now, I know new homes are operating in a different market, but nonetheless, there is a benefit to the developers in putting gigabit connectivity into new homes, certainly marketing wise. Right, next one, please, Anna. So moving on to the actual requirements, the aim is to, when a new dwelling is constructed, is to ensure that that has connectivity. And if we can't make the connectivity, is to make sure that it has the infrastructure to best future-proof for connectivity when it is available. So there's two things going on there. One is the infrastructure and the other one is the connectivity itself. We've broken the substantive requirements down into two bits. So one is what we call gigabit ready physical infrastructure. I'll just call that infrastructure for short from now on. And the other one is the gigabit capable connectivity, and I'll call that the connectivity for short. So the first requirement, the infrastructure, what we call requirement RA1, is to provide infrastructure right to from the network termination point at the dwelling to the network distribution point on the network operator's spine or backbone, whatever they call the infrastructure. If they can't do that, it's to do that as close as reasonably practicable, where you don't perhaps have rights over land or for other reasons, but I'll talk about that in more detail later. And then the second requirement, which we call RA2, is the gigabit capable connection. That is a requirement subject to a cost cap of £2,000 per each dwelling. If you're not able to secure a connection within that cost cap, then we're looking for the next fastest connection, super fast, possibly going down even to universal service obligation, provided again that can be done within the cost cap. I mentioned in the first slide that actually to help reduce costs, we've introduced this cost cap. We've also secured commitments from network operators to contribute towards the costs. Next one, please, Alan. Right, so what's in scope? Right, first off, just to put some parameters on this, we're talking about regulations that commenced on the 26th of December 22, Boxing Day. So any applications made after Boxing Day for new homes will need to include the new requirements to put infrastructure in and connectivity. If you happen to put your application in before Boxing Day 2022 and you can physically start work before Boxing Day this year, then you can build to the old regulations, i.e. you don't need the connectivity. So there is a transitional approach in the regulations. Another parameter is what we're talking about is the erection or construction of new dwellings in England only. Yeah, that is new standalone dwellings or indeed new dwellings in a mixed use. So you could have a block which has got shops on the bottom and flats above. So we're looking at the new dwelling element of mixed use buildings. It includes dwellings in conservation areas, but would note there that planning obligations would need to be observed in listed buildings and that sort of thing, conservation areas. Next one, please. Sorry, I should have, I will stay on this slide, but I should have said in the previous slide that this is England only. I do know that Scotland and Wales are developing their own policies and requirements. Northern Ireland, I'm not sure about. So on this slide then. So I mentioned newly erected dwellings. What is out of scope is new homes that are created by material change of use, so conversions, if you like. We did look at that, but there were too many technical challenges to regulate in that area. So it does not include conversions. It does not include rooms for residential purposes, which is what the kind of things like nurses' homes, hotels, student accommodation, that sort of thing. We're talking about dwellings for occupants, basically, for families. Also, it doesn't include the erection of wholly non-residential buildings or existing buildings that undergo renovation. For those buildings, the old Part R, the 2016 Part R access requirements still apply. Yeah, and we've dropped those in the approved document, R Volume 2, which there's a link for at the bottom there. So if you like, the old what used to be termed the hole in the wall regs still apply for non-residential buildings and buildings that undergo renovation, whether they're residential or non-residential. Okay, next one, please. Right, so getting into a bit of the detail now. So let's focus on the physical infrastructure. Right, so the infrastructure, this is the ducts, the manholes, the chambers, that sort of thing. This requirement applies even if a connection is not being installed. Yeah, the idea here is that the ideal is that we're doing connection and infrastructure, but if we're not doing connection, then the idea is we put infrastructure in up to a point that is practicable and possible to future-proof the development for connectivity when it becomes available in the future. So just be clear on that. Now, the ideal is that we do put this infrastructure all the way from the network distribution point on the spine right through to the network termination point at the dwelling. But that may not always be possible. If the developer doesn't have access rights over land, it would not be possible for me to make a regulation that says you must do that, because I cannot sanction you for something that you can't possibly do. So, you know, there are limits to this. So where there is no right to install, we've got this tiered approach. The idea is that where there is where you haven't got land access rights, or the network termination point doesn't quite exist yet, that you do put the infrastructure in as far as you possibly can. And there are some nuances in that as well. It's whether you can put it to the edge of the development, or if you don't know where the network distribution point is going to be, just to the access point on the building. That sounds a bit confusing, I know. So the best thing to do, I think, is a series of slides with diagrams. If you can move on, please, Alan, that hopefully explain this a bit more easily. A picture paints 1,000 words. So this is the default position. So you're installing the gigabit cable connection, or you're installing connection, and you're putting the infrastructure through right from the network termination point at each individual dwelling, right through to the network distribution point. That's the stuff in green there on the diagram. Now that for an individual house will be from the access point to the network distribution point. But for a multiple occupancy building, that would also include in-building infrastructure as well. And I'll come on to that later. So that is the default position. Yeah, next one, please. Right, but that's not always possible because you don't have access rights to install that infrastructure. So if a connection is not being made available, we're still looking for the infrastructure to be installed to the point as near as possible to that network distribution point, but recognizing that you cannot install in that land. Yeah. This will help future-proof the development for future connection when it becomes available, when you get the rights to install in the land. Right, next one, please. Right, and then it gets a little bit more nuanced. Right, so here we haven't got a network distribution point in place, but in the engagement between the developer and the network operator, we established that actually, where there are plans to roll out the gigabit network in that area in 2024, wherever it might be, and if we know there's going to be a network distribution point within a 2-year period, and that 2-year period is written into the regulations and guidance, the idea is, and that green square on the diagram there is supposed to represent the development, is that you put the infrastructure in from, again, each network termination point in the building through to a point that you have access to on your development that is in the, or pointed to the area where the network termination point, network distribution point is going to be. Yeah. So that's what we're looking for in that instance. Next one, please. Right, here, there is no network distribution point. We don't know where one's going to be put for the foreseeable future, so within the relevant 2-year period. So all we ask for in this instance is that the infrastructure is or access only job, really. So we do need the in-building infrastructure where there's a multi-occupancy building. Otherwise, it's back to the hole in the wall regulations, which is no different to what the old PAR was really. So where we don't know where the network distribution point is, there's no point in running external infrastructure. We just go to the access point at the building. Right, and the final diagram, please. Right, this one just dwells on the in-building infrastructure. So if it's an individual building, individual house, we're looking for, perhaps a bit flippantly call it a hole in the wall regs, but you know, we are looking for an access point at the building, and that needs to be to observe sort of moisture penetration, that sort of thing. But that's what we're looking for, simple access to the building. Yeah. But in a multi-occupancy building, we're looking for a bit more. We're looking for the in-building infrastructure, and that's shown hopefully on the right-hand diagram there. A note on that point, and there is a note in the approved document in relation to this, that we are very keen to stress that where penetration through fire compartmentation, walls, floors, ceilings, needs to be properly fire stopped in light of the Grenfell tragedy and all the news you see on sort of safety of high-rise buildings. So I would stress that point, that we are seeking in building infrastructure to be properly fire stopped, please. Right, next one, please. Right, so that is the infrastructure. So moving on now to the second requirement, which is the gigabit capable connection or the connectivity, and this has a cost cap linked to it. So what we're after is the installation of at least one functioning gigabit cable connection from the network distribution point to the network termination point at each new dwelling on development. Yeah, I'll stress the at least. That's the requirement. That's the legal requirement to put at least one in. You builders, developers are free to voluntarily install more than one, and often that will be the case where you're offering future home occupiers a choice of broadband provider. I would also stress the functioning. We're not after an ongoing provision of broadband. What we're after is a connection that works. Yeah, come back to that later. Having said that, if in your engagement with network operators, it's evident that the provision of a gigabit cable connection is going to exceed that cost cap, and that's after any financial contributions from network operators have been factored in, yeah, then the idea is that you move down to the next fastest technology. I believe that's super fast, and then I believe you go down to universal service obligation. Again, if that next fastest technology exceeds the cost cap and you can't provide a connection at all, then that's where the exemption jumps in. Yeah. Now factored into that cost cap is the cost of the connection and VAT, but not the cost of the infrastructure or the ongoing provision of broadband services. So we're talking about the cost of the connectivity here only. If you can't put gigabit in, you drop to the next fastest. If you're super fast, if you can't put that in, you drop to the next fastest. If you can't put that in, all within a cost cap, then there is an exemption. However, you're still required to install the infrastructure in line with the tiered approach that we outlined in those diagrams earlier. Right, next one, please, Alan. Right, so that is the, if you like, what I call the substantive requirements, the physical things that developers need to do to install infrastructure, to install connectivity. But there's also a new regulation been made, which is, if you like, a process regulation. And this requires developers to submit with their building regulations application, whether that's a full plans application or a building notice to a local authority, or whether that's in conjunction with an approved inspector, an initial notice. The requirement is to submit what we call particulars of the gigabit ready infrastructure and gigabit capable connections. We call that the connectivity plan for short. Now what we've put in the approved document in volume 1, the new homes volume, is a model form, example form that you can use to outline the kind of information in terms of, obviously, it's plot address, contractor, network operator, the quotes, perhaps the diagrams, locations, etc., timelines that need to be provided to explain to building control what you're planning to do. Now, to make life easier for those builders who are already doing this, we've broken this plan down into two parts. So if you're doing it all, if you're putting the connectivity in, gigabit connectivity, you're doing the infrastructure, just fill out part A, and that's almost just the the address, who you are, where you are, what you're doing. Yeah. However, if you're seeking an exemption on the connectivity, you're going to a slower speed perhaps, or an exemption full stop, and similarly reducing the amount of infrastructure you're putting in, then part B of the form needs to be completed. And the kind of thing, additional evidence we're looking for there is that you can demonstrate that you've gone to 2 suitable network operators and the quotes exceed the cost cap, or you've gone to 2 network operators and they've blankly refused to provide a connection in that particular area. It might be a remote area perhaps. So it is a developer duty to complete and submit that connectivity plan to building control at the point of the building regulations application. Yeah. So that means you need to be ready for that at the point of your building regs application. Come on to the application before then, later. Right, next one, please. Right, there are some sort of straight legal exemptions as well. So if you're not pushing the infrastructure bites, even if we're not putting the connection in, that's the first point. I keep reiterating that point. But there are some fairly exceptional circumstances where there's a legal exemption that you don't have to put the infrastructure in. And that might be because it's a sensitive site, an MOD site, that sort of thing, or that the dwelling is so remote from the public electronic communications network to even, there's nothing there at all. You can't even put a universal service obligation, connection in. It's just so remote that you can't justify even putting the infrastructure in, or an access point even. But those would be few and far between. Next one, please. Right. There are also some exemptions from the connectivity requirement. I've already mentioned the cost cap. If you can't put gigabit in, you move down to the next fastest, then down to the next fastest. If you can't put that in and you've approached at least two network operators and they didn't respond, or they within 30 days, they didn't respond within 30 days, or they declined outright to provide a connection, and there's 2 of those, then that's taken as an exemption from the connectivity requirement. Next one, please. Right, so this duty does fall on developers, which is this audience. There are no requirements on network operators, no new requirements. However, some have made financial commitments to contribute to these connectivity requirements, and there is a commercial incentive for network operators to engage and contribute as well, depending on the number of homes being built. We certainly there are also new duties on the building control bodies, and we have also engaged with them. Did a big LABC webinar just before the holidays. So that'll be local authority building control and approved inspectors, because they will need to assess these connectivity plans and also look at what you're installing and final certificates, that sort of thing. So next one, please. Right, this just outlines the sort of key stages. I did have a load of stage slides, but in conscious of time, we've dropped those out of this webinar, but I think they are going to be provided to you in the follow-up recording, that sort of thing. So there are 5 stages. There's planning connectivity, depositing the connectivity plan, the building control assessment, obviously the installation and inspection by building control, and then the final sign-off for building control. Now, of those stages, stage 1 is not a legal requirement. Yeah, there is no legal requirement to plan connectivity, but if we can move on to the next slide, please. Early engagement is, however, key. So the first point at which there's a legal requirement is when a developer has to submit the connectivity plan for building control consideration approval. Yeah, so that is stage 2. But in order to get to that point, we would strongly encourage that developers engage with network operators well up front, so they've got the evidence together, the quotes, the evidence if they're seeking an exemption, the plans if they're going ahead, in order to inform that connectivity plan. Yeah. So it is fairly critical, I would say essential, to have that early engagement in order for the developer to meet the legal obligations that kick in from stage 2 onwards. Okay. Right. Final slide, I think. Right, so as I said, there are some individual stage slides. They will be provided for those who want to look through those. But here is some links where you'll find additional information. The regulations themselves are on legislation.gov.uk. The statutory guidance, that's approved document R volume 1 for infrastructure and connectivity to new homes, and approved document R volume 2, access only requirements for wholly non-residential buildings and renovations. That's all available on gov.uk at the second link. There is a circular and a accompanying letter, which is worth a look at as well. That explains in particular how the transitional provisions work, and what you've got to do once you put your application in. If you put it in before 26th December, you do have that year's grace. And finally, we have uploaded material onto what we call the Government Digital Connectivity Portal. That link at the bottom there. There is that's a place where we put everything together. So the regulations, the guidance, the consultations, and some additional material. We'll perhaps come back to that later during this panel session. Right. Hopefully that's me. It's just before 5 o'clock, so we should hopefully have a bit of time for panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. There we are. You could keep your camera on, Paul, so that we can see you as and when there are questions that come up that you might want to answer. And if the guys from OpenReach would like to join us, put the cameras on now as well, that'd be great. Thank you. Hi, Sam and Andy. So I'm going to ask a stupid question, because I told everybody at the beginning of this that there's no such thing as a stupid question. But I might be about to ask one, because as Paul was speaking, I was thinking about these situations where you can only get as far as an access point. You can't get the connection all the way to where it needs to be eventually. Am I making sense so far? What do you put at the end of the ducting that it forms that access point? Is there some kind of green cabinet like the one that I've got outside my house that has to sit there until such time as a connection can be made, or how does that work?
No, so Hayley, the OpenReach full fibre network is fully underground. So in the past, where you would have seen green street furniture, the cabinets you mentioned, that's our older technology. So our full fibre network, which is gigabit compliant to the legislation, is fully underground. Now, normally with developers, we'd work to fully install. So that would be an end-to-end connectivity. So we'd install our equipment into the home, and that network would then work all the way back to our exchange. It's very rare that we wouldn't be able to make that full connectivity plan with a developer. There would be perhaps one scenario where there's third-party land that sits in between our network and the developer's on-site land, which could delay the installation. A good example of that would be National Highways or National Rail. If you're having to cross their land, it can be quite time-consuming and lengthy to do. So we would kind of work with the developer to get as pre-installed as we can do either end of that land we have to cross, and we would work with building control to see if that would work as a connectivity plan for that particular circumstance. But other than that, that's very rare, and we'd normally expect to have the full end-to-end connectivity, Hayley.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question from someone in the audience about what is the benefit for me as a developer of putting fibre into a property other than just because I have to? So look,
I mean, obviously as OpenReach, it's going to be very easy for me to extol the virtues of full fibre. I mean, something we often talk about is if you look back over the last couple of years and the abrupt changes to the way that we live and work as a result of the COVID pandemic, which began in kind of March 2020, I think what it really shone a light on was how good connectivity has now become an essential requirement of the modern family. You know, whether that is now allowing your children to remain connected to their education, to remain entertained, keeping you connected to friends and family, or allowing you to work from home. And certainly as we've exited the kind of pandemic stage, and you've seen that flexibility around where people can live and work with their employers, one thing we hear more and more from developers is that people want to be able to work from home. They're being able to move out of those commuter belts, move into kind of places which are further away from their head office. And to do that, they need that good full fibre connectivity to connect. The other thing I'd say, Hayley, is that full fibre as a network is much more resilient. So the older copper technology is more prone to faults, particularly caused by the weather. So full fibre has that better resilience. In terms also of studies we've seen, it's proved that having good full fibre or good broadband connectivity can positively influence the house price. Not having it actually has a negative impact. Now, this is all kind of available. It's external kind of insight that's been done. One stat said that it has up to a 1% improvement on house price and a negative 3% for having bad broadband. Also, recent studies from estate agents has put good broadband as actually one of the top things that people are now asking for when it comes to buying their new home. You know, it's right up there above schools or connection to kind of roads, infrastructures and schools. So actually, it starts to become not just what is the value of having it, but could I even sell a home in the new world without good broadband, given that it's that important to people?
Okay.
And
Anybody
Hayley,
have
I would,
anything to add?
yeah, I'd just add, Hayley, just to, as a homeowner, to Andy's point, I recently moved home in the last few years, trying to look for that perfect next move. And for me, I was looking at 2 properties, and I've got a young family, and what made the difference for me was the fact that the property that I preferred didn't have the level of broadband that I would be hoping for, and therefore ended up going for the second home that I was my second on my list. So I think it's definitely become, and as I spoke to the estate agents at that point, it's definitely from their perspective become more and more of a commodity. You know, children will say they find it more attractive than gas and electric, although I don't know how they would run their computers without electric.
Yeah.
I mean, from that stat, Hayley, if you look at in Scotland, it was actually the top thing now from an estate agent's point of view that people ask for when buying a new home. It's number 2 in the UK. So look, it has become that important in terms of decisions that people will make when they're looking at their new home.
Okay, interesting. So building on that, we have another question here, and this is definitely a developer talking from the question that I can see here. So he is saying, or they are saying, if we are supplying Openreach with ready-made infrastructure and customers, can we expect to receive a percentage of the future income for using our infrastructure and ducting? How would you respond to that?
Look, what we work with developers is to kind of have our infrastructure built as part of the development of that site being developed. If we were not to do that, the risk is that people would be moving in with no access to broadband, and then Openreach has very difficult access. So look, there isn't that percentage share that the question's asked. This is about the right thing to do from a commercial viability point of view. A network provider simply can't come into a finished new site and get broadband to new homeowners easily. So if a developer wouldn't work with a network provider, such as Openreach or any of the others, then it's the risk that I just mentioned. You know, you would end up with a completed new site, roads and services all finished, no access to broadband, and then the network provider commercially, it's not viable for us to come in. So it's the right thing to do to kind of make sure that homeowner has access to that.
Okay, great. And I saw that there was another question about the cost for developers to put the gigabit capable broadband in, which you've answered, Andy, on the chat, if anybody's interested to go in and read that about the developer contribution for sites of more than 20 plots. So, and you've also posted the link to the rate card for smaller sites than that, which we can share with attendees after the webinar as well. We can put that in the follow-up email if that would be useful. So, yeah, I don't know if anybody's got any more questions to bring up. Please do. It's now or never at this point in time, or any other comments that any of our speakers would like to add.
Well, I think whilst we're waiting for further questions, sorry, Paul. So whilst we're waiting for further questions, Hayley, look, it's kind of worth stressing here that kind of Openreach, we're the largest national provider of broadband infrastructure in the UK. We're a wholesale network, so we don't sell a service direct to the homeowner. That comes from the service providers who sell their retail products over our wholesale network. So the likes of BT, TalkTalk, Sky, EE, Vodafone, so on. It's worth noting, though, that there are, I think, over 100 network providers all available in the UK at the moment, to varying sizes and scales, so not always geographically available where someone would build. But I just want to make sure that point is made to the developers on the call and that will listen in later. Openreach is just one of the network providers they can work with. Obviously, we clearly want them to come to us. We want to make sure they've got access to that wholesale list of providers that I've mentioned earlier. But there are other options out there who would all have their own kind of pricing options when it came to particularly the smaller sites and connecting them to their infrastructures.
Okay, that's a useful point. Thank you. Paul, did you want to make?
I was sort of linked to that into some extent. I was going to ask Alan if he could perhaps put on the screen the link to the digital connectivity portal that I provided, whether that's possible.
I'm sure he can.
Well, hopefully that will flag out in a minute. What we've done here, right? Okay, this is literally uploaded 30th of January, so yesterday, and if you just scroll down slowly, Alan, if that's possible on there, right? So nothing new here. We've put in links. It's all in one place now for developers. There's a link to the regulations, the sort of regulations have been amended, or the amended regulations and the regulations that have been amended, and also to the statutory guidance there. So that's nothing new. Those links are in the presentation as well. Keep scrolling down. Right, there is the circular letter where you'll see the transition provisions. There are the consultations. There's a policy consultation taken out some time ago, I think, by DCMS, but I became involved with the technical consultation, so you can see what we consulted upon and what government's decision was. The response is there. And if we keep going down, then the requirements are just summarised, which is really what I've got. I've summarised on the slides. The two substantive requirements for infrastructure connectivity, the cost cap, the tiered approach. If we can keep scrolling slowly, Alan, please. The cost cap application, blah blah blah. Right, there's also there a link to the network operator commitments that have been made. If you scroll a tad more, please. Is that stop? No, there it is. Right. So there's a link to the commitments that Openreach, Virgin Media, and GigaClear have made. But they're not just. I mean, other network operators will have a commercial interest in contributing and engaging. Right. Scope. Nothing extra there. That just tells us which buildings it applies to and where it applies to. Evidence. Right. Now this is. If I can find in a suitable network operator, this is what Andy was alluding to. So, obviously Openreach, Virgin Media, there are some big ones out there, but there are other network operators around, particularly in some of the regions. And there are two trade associations there, I think I'm right in saying that, where their membership is listed. So that might help developers find suitable network operators in their particular location. Yeah. Keep going down. And this links to the this links to the first question. The building regulations and the approved documents we write are technology neutral, and they're performance based. Now, the examples in those diagrams I showed you were based on full fibre to the premises. I think that's what you call it, FTTP. However, there are other ways of doing it. There may be some locations where you might have to use a different sort of cable. I mean, I'm looking outside my window here. I've got fibre in the ground, but it gets to a telephone pole, and then there's some other kind of cable that's waiting to be installed. But also, it might be fixed wireless access is another means. It may well be that there's some kind of geographic issue or land access issue, and for fixed wireless access might provide a route forward here. The only thing I would say is in the building regulations, we're talking about fixed. So if you go down the wireless access route, or even, dare I say, satellite, even along quite a lot nowadays, we would be looking for something fixed at the dwelling. Yeah, we're not suggesting you can do this with your mobile phone. Yeah, just to make that point. So I think that's been uploaded. Potentially more information will be added to that as we go along. But that's a single place where you can find a lot of resource to help for the developers to find out information. Right.
Yeah, it's great that that's all in one place. And I noticed that you can register to have an email alert if anything's added or changed, which also could be useful to people. So we'll certainly put that link in the follow-up email. Thank you. I don't know if you're maybe aware, Paul, or if anyone is, are there plans to extend the scope of this legislation to other types of buildings? in the future? Because, you know, things like university halls of residence, which you mentioned are outside of scope currently, will they be being brought into this legislation at some point, do you think?
I don't know the answer to that one. That would
Okay.
be for DCMS, but that's something we can take away and ask. You know, we've got this, you know, there are these commitments for national gigabit capable deployment. We didn't capture conversions. As you say, there are wholly non-residential buildings, although there are commercial interests in those sorts of businesses wanting to connect. You probably couldn't run your business without connection. But yeah, that would be for DCMS, who are the keepers of the policy.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So someone has asked, what's the best point to engage with a network provider? I think that was a point that you mentioned in the presentation, Paul, but it'd be worth revisiting that, I think.
Sorry, yes, right, I will come in on that. Perhaps Andy might want to come in on this later as well. Right, so the decision was to take forward the policy implementation through building regulations, which is a decision that was taken by senior officials and ministers. That's fine. That's okay, but building regulations can come along quite late in the process, which is why we've introduced not just the requirement is to put in infrastructure tiered approach, put in the connectivity subject to the cost cap, etc. There's substantive physical things, but also to try and bring it as upfront as we can to say, well, look, developers, you've got to submit your connectivity plan with your application. If you cannot submit the connectivity plan with your application, there's a possibility that your application will be rejected by building control, and therefore you wouldn't be able to start on site potentially. So that's the best we can do. My view on it is you probably want to be engaging. I mean, Andy mentioned things about highways and rail networks a number of months before that, perhaps at the time you're thinking about planning would be a sensible place to perhaps start engaging with your preferred network operators. But Andy, I'll ask if you want to come in on over that.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I can give a very quick answer. So 6 months. That is the standard guidance we give for developers to register with Openreach to allow us the time to build in the offsite network. Now, it may sound a lot, and I think sometimes developers have the misconception that because they can see Openreach infrastructure outside their site, it'll be straightforward and easy to connect them, but that doesn't necessarily mean we've got capacity there. So we could be building further back in our network within the public highway. Like I've mentioned rails and roads earlier. Look, even as straightforward as sometimes you have to give a 3-month notice if you need to dig into a road within the public highway. And then you get things like embargoes in certain times of the year as well. So you can quickly see how 6 months sounds a lot, but actually in the real world, that's a reasonable amount of time for us to do the necessary offsite work needed.
Okay, so it pays to think ahead, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Early engagement is absolutely key.
Great. Someone's asked another question here, which I'm not quite sure I understand, but I'm hoping that you guys will. So they've said, oh, are we able to put one large infrastructure duct on the side and sell for the highest price? What do you think about that? Anybody?
I will try to answer that one, I think, Hayley. So my answer would be no. Reason being is that certainly as Openreach, look, I can't answer on behalf of all network providers. Openreach will only use our own network to install our infrastructure, and that has to be supplied through Openreach. So we free issue the stores materials for developers to put into their site for us, and we later on adopt that network as long as it's to the standard to be adopted. I think the scenario that, if I'm understanding correctly, of installing the ducts and then selling to a network provider to use later on certainly wouldn't work for Openreach. But as I say, I'm not speaking on behalf of all network provider industry here.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. Well, I think we've got no new questions coming in at this point, and we have been going for 45 minutes or so. So we'll probably wrap it up at this point. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to our speakers today. Our next webinar is on the 14th of February, when we've got the Brownfield Institute coming to talk about developing on brownfield sites. So another one in our series of guidance for property developers. So please join us for that if you're able. Thanks once again to Andy, Sam, and the other contributors from Openreach, and also to Paul for the presentation. that was really clear, and I now understand a lot more about the gigabit legislation than I did before, so that's a good thing, and hopefully the members attending too do as well, and we'll send out the follow-up email as promised. So thank you for joining us today. Goodbye, everybody.